Welcome to my channel. Before we dive into this chilling story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because we've spent countless hours digging through true historical records to bring you this story. This is the tale of two enslaved sisters in Louisiana in 1841, whose cunning, cruelty, and vengeance left 4 families destroyed. A story so dark history almost tried to forget. The story of the savage slave sisters begins long before the destruction they would later bring upon 4 families. Born into the harsh realities of a Louisiana plantation in 1841, the sisters grew up in an environment designed to break spirits and bend wills. Their childhood was marked by relentless labor from dawn until dusk, the constant threat of punishment, and a household that offered little more than survival. Yet, from an early age, the sisters displayed intelligence and cunning far beyond their years. While most children on the plantation learned to obey out of fear, these two learned to observe, to notice patterns, weaknesses, and the unspoken tensions that existed between the enslavers and the enslaved. They were quiet, often keeping to themselves, yet they were always watching. They understood the subtle hierarchies among the enslaved workers, who could be trusted, who could be manipulated, and who was dangerous. And they also understood the weaknesses of the families who controlled the plantation. The sisters' father was a skilled field hand, respected but powerless, and their mother had a sharp tongue and sharper wit, which she used sparingly. But the sisters inherited both her cunning and their father's resilience. By the age of 12, they had learned not only to survive, but to anticipate danger and exploit opportunities. Early incidents hinted at the sisters' potential for calculating action. They would secretly sabotage tools, hide vital supplies, and manipulate other enslaved workers into performing tasks that caused trouble for their overseers, all without drawing suspicion. Their acts were small at first, seemingly innocent mistakes or accidents that could be easily explained away. But there was a method to everything. They were practicing, honing the skills they would later use to devastating effect. Even as children, the sisters were intensely bonded, sharing an understanding that went beyond words. Their communication was subtle, a glance, a nod. A slight shift in posture could convey volumes. This silent coordination allowed them to execute plans with precision, something even the adults on the plantation could not anticipate. Many of the overseers dismissed them as harmless girls, underestimating the intellect and patience that ran through their veins. Socially, they were isolated by design. The families of the plantation often sought to control the interactions of enslaved children, keeping them separate to prevent alliances or gatherings. But the sisters thrived in this forced solitude. They used it to study human behavior, particularly that of their enslavers. They memorized schedules, observed who was vulnerable, and noted the flaws and weaknesses of the 4 families who would later become their targets. Their youth and small stature allowed them to move unnoticed, giving them the perfect cover to gather information, plan minor acts of defiance, and sow the seeds of chaos that would grow into something far more terrifying. Their early life also forged an intense sense of justice and, later, vengeance. Every lash, every insult, every humiliation they witnessed or endured was stored away, calculated, and mentally catalogued. Unlike other children who accepted oppression passively, these sisters seemed to internalize it as a challenge, a problem to solve. They were not motivated purely by malice in their youth, but by an acute awareness that the system was designed to crush them, and if they were ever to have power, they would need to understand the levers and pressures that ruled their world. By the time they reached adolescence, the sisters were no longer just children. They were strategists in miniature. They could manipulate situations, provoke conflicts between other enslaved workers, and quietly test the limits of their master's patience. Even their play, seemingly innocent games with the other children, became exercises in planning, misdirection, and subtle influence. Every act was part of a broader education in control, observation, and psychological warfare. It was in this early life of observation, cunning, and silent defiance that the foundation for the sisters' later legendary cruelty was laid. Their childhoods, though marked by suffering, also nurtured their extraordinary abilities to read people, anticipate actions, and execute complex schemes with precision. What began as survival slowly evolved into mastery of human behavior, a mastery that, when fully unleashed, would leave 4 families utterly destroyed and a place in history forever stained by fear and awe of their names. The first acts of rebellion by the sisters were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but they were anything but accidental. By the time they reached their early teens, the sisters had perfected the art of manipulation, understanding both the vulnerabilities of their enslavers and the fears of those around them. Their schemes began with small, calculated disruptions, tools misplaced, minor accidents staged to appear as careless mistakes, livestock let loose or mysteriously sickened, and food supplies hidden or spoiled. Each act was designed to test the reactions of the plantation owners, gauge the limits of their authority, and quietly build a reputation that would later serve as both cover and leverage for more sinister plans. At first, these acts were dismissed as youthful mischief. The families, accustomed to the strict hierarchies and obedience demanded on the plantation, rarely suspected the quiet, observant girls of orchestrating these incidents. Yet the sisters did not operate recklessly. Every movement, every whisper, and every glance was intentional. They would subtly manipulate other enslaved workers into performing small tasks that appeared helpful but were actually part of a larger plan to destabilize their overseers. This early mastery of psychological manipulation allowed them to spread fear and confusion without ever revealing their hand. The sisters also began to exploit the rivalries and tensions between the families on the plantation. They observed that certain family members were overly prideful, quick to anger, or easily manipulated through flattery or fear. Using this knowledge, they planted seeds of doubt, encouraged arguments, and created circumstances where minor disputes would escalate into significant conflicts. They understood the human desire for control and the ease with which it could be disrupted. By carefully nudging the adults into making mistakes, they created opportunities to further their influence while remaining ostensibly innocent. One of the first truly calculated acts of revenge involved the death of a prized animal on the plantation. The sisters had noticed that the overseer, who was responsible for managing the livestock, often left gates unlatched and rarely inspected the pens at night. Working together, the sisters stealthily opened the gate to the corral under the cover of darkness, allowing the animals to escape into the surrounding swamp. The ensuing chaos resulted in the loss of several valuable animals, causing the overseer to suffer the wrath of the plantation owner. To any observer, It appeared as a tragic accident, but in reality, it was a deliberate and meticulously planned act of vengeance and control. These early acts were not born from simple malice, but from a deep understanding of power and survival. The sisters were painfully aware that open rebellion would result in severe punishment or death. So they developed a method of quiet resistance, actions that could be interpreted as accidents, mistakes, or misfortune, yet carried real consequences for those in authority. They learned to exploit the fear and superstition of their enslavers, using rumors, misdirection, and carefully timed incidents to unsettle the adults who believed themselves in control. At the same time, the sisters were growing increasingly bold. They began to understand that fear could be more effective than physical punishment in controlling others. By cultivating an aura of unpredictability and insinuating themselves into moments of tension, they could exert influence without ever appearing overtly threatening. Their presence alone began to unsettle the overseers and plantation owners, who could not identify the source of their unease. This psychological dominance became a powerful tool, allowing the sisters to manipulate events from behind the scenes while maintaining a facade of obedience and innocence. The first acts of rebellion also had a social dimension. The sisters used their intelligence and observation to influence other enslaved workers subtly. By rewarding compliance with small gestures of attention and manipulating those who resisted through fear or shame, they established a quiet network of control. This network enabled them to gather information, anticipate threats, and orchestrate complex plans with precision. It also ensured that when the sisters acted, few could challenge them without risking retaliation, either real or perceived. It was during this period that the sisters' reputation began to take shape. Stories of unexplained mishaps, missing items, and minor disasters began circulating among the families on the plantation. While no one suspected the sisters directly, the unease they caused was palpable. Adults whispered about the cursed girls with wary fascination, while the enslaved workers, though wary of punishment, recognized the growing power the sisters quietly wielded. This combination of fear, respect, and uncertainty laid the foundation for the sisters' later, more destructive actions. By the end of their early teenage years, the sisters had effectively transformed themselves into strategists and manipulators. Their acts of rebellion were no longer random or reactive. They were deliberate, measured, and often extraordinarily clever. Each incident taught them more about human nature, the limits of authority, and the ways fear could be leveraged. In the shadows of the Louisiana plantation, they were quietly preparing for the dramatic and violent events that would one day leave 4 families in ruin. As the sisters grew older, their subtle acts of rebellion evolved into calculated, far-reaching schemes that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the first 2 families on the plantation. By now in their late teens, they had become masters of observation, manipulation, and patience. Every incident they had engineered in their youth had honed their skills, teaching them not only how to provoke misfortune without being caught, but also how to anticipate reactions, exploit weaknesses, and turn small opportunities into devastating consequences. It was during this period that the sisters' true cunning began to manifest in ways that no one could ignore. The first family to fall victim to their calculated wrath was the plantation owner's extended relatives, who had recently moved into a nearby estate under the assumption of safety and prosperity. The sisters, knowing the family's habits, began subtly undermining their sense of security. They sabotaged food stores, tampered with livestock, and manipulated minor household accidents to appear as negligence on the part of servants. Yet the incidents always seemed to target the family members themselves, leaving the sisters' hands clean. By spreading rumors among the staff and planting small seeds of mistrust, they orchestrated a chain of conflicts that escalated without direct confrontation. Disputes that began over trivial matters, missing items, minor injuries, or mismanaged work, soon turned into bitter arguments between family members, exposing long-suppressed rivalries and resentments. It was not just psychological manipulation that led to the first family's ruin. The sisters used their knowledge of poisons, learned in secret from an older enslaved woman who had survived the harshness of plantation life, by cunning and stealth to further their plans. Small doses of natural toxins were introduced into meals, subtly weakening the family's health over weeks. No single incident was enough to draw suspicion, but cumulatively, the family grew pale, ill-tempered, and fearful. The sisters' interventions were always precise, the timing was deliberate, ensuring that the blame would fall elsewhere, often on servants or chance mishaps. By the time the first family realized something was amiss, it was far too late. Their wealth had been compromised, relationships destroyed, and their standing among the community deeply tarnished. The collapse of this family was seen by neighbors as a tragic misfortune, yet behind the scenes, it was the calculated work of the sisters at its heart. Emboldened by their success with the first family, the sisters turned their attention to the second. This family had been skeptical of rumors surrounding the sisters, dismissing the whispers of mischief and malevolence as superstition. However, they too fell victim to the sisters' cunning strategies. By exploiting the family's weaknesses, particularly their vanity, overconfidence, and distrust of their own staff, the sisters created situations that forced the family into panic and poor decision-making. Letters were intercepted, alliances within the household were manipulated, and even small disputes were engineered to escalate into crises. Within months, the second family experienced financial setbacks, unexplained illnesses, and growing paranoia. Friends and neighbors began to avoid them, sensing instability that could not be explained by normal misfortune. The sisters' brilliance lay not only in the acts themselves, but in their understanding of perception and reputation. They ensured that neither family could directly trace their misfortunes back to them. Instead, every event appeared coincidental or the result of human error. Servants were blamed, animals were blamed, even the elements seemed to conspire against the families. It was a psychological form of warfare that left both families isolated, weakened, and eventually destitute. People spoke of the misfortunes in hushed tones, fearful of the unseen hand guiding these tragedies. And in this way, the sisters cultivated fear not only among their victims, but throughout the wider community. By the end of the downfall of the first two families, it became clear that the sisters were not ordinary enslaved individuals. They were strategists and tacticians of extraordinary skill. Their actions demonstrated a terrifying combination of intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. What began as subtle rebellion had escalated into targeted devastation, leaving no visible trace of their involvement while dismantling the social and economic foundations of their victims. Each move had been deliberate, each consequence meticulously planned and each reaction carefully anticipated. The first two families' ruin also sent a warning to others nearby. Stories of accidents, mysterious illnesses, and inexplicable misfortunes began to circulate, creating an aura of dread around the sisters. Although no one could prove their culpability, the pattern of destruction was undeniable. People whispered about the shadow of the sisters, a presence that brought misfortune without touch, punishment without provocation. In the minds of the enslaved and the free alike, the sisters had become more than humans. They were a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of both fear and awe. By systematically dismantling these two families, the sisters solidified their power in ways that were almost supernatural in perception. Their intelligence, patience, and understanding of human psychology allowed them to manipulate outcomes without drawing suspicion. Each family's collapse was a testament to their calculated planning and the strategic use of fear, reputation, and knowledge. The fall of the first two families would serve as the prelude to the even more devastating destruction of the next two, establishing the sisters' legacy as one of the most cunning and feared figures in Louisiana's dark history. After the calculated ruin of the first two families, the sisters' confidence and cunning had grown exponentially. By now, they were no longer merely survivors of the harsh realities of plantation life. They had become strategists, experts in manipulation, and orchestrators of fear. Their actions were deliberate, each move planned far in advance, and their knowledge of human nature was unparalleled. The remaining two families on the plantation, and those in nearby households, soon found themselves ensnared in the sisters' web of vengeance, manipulation, and psychological warfare. The third family, neighbors who had long looked down upon the enslaved population, proved to be particularly arrogant and dismissive. They had heard the whispers about the sisters, but assumed them to be mere folklore, a way for enslaved people to cope with their oppression. This underestimation would prove fatal. The sisters began subtly exploiting the family's pride and vanity. They sabotaged correspondence and messages, causing misunderstandings that escalated into serious disputes within the family. They encouraged servants to act in ways that seemed negligent, all while carefully manipulating the perception of the family's actions from outsiders. Slowly, the third family's reputation began to crack, their internal cohesion weakening under the constant, unseen pressure orchestrated by the sisters. Illness and misfortune followed as the sisters expanded their reach. Using herbs and knowledge gleaned from older members of the enslaved community, they subtly introduced ailments into the households. No one could pinpoint the cause, and doctors were baffled. Meals seemed to be cursed with sickness. Livestock fell ill at inconvenient times, and minor accidents compounded into catastrophic events. The third family grew anxious, fearful, and increasingly paranoid. Their once controlled world had become unpredictable, and the sisters' careful orchestration ensured that each misfortune appeared as coincidence or bad luck. By the time the family realized their position, they were already trapped in a downward spiral, their power and influence eroding with each passing week. The sisters' manipulation extended beyond direct actions to psychological control. They understood the importance of reputation and fear, not just within the plantation but throughout the surrounding community. Stories of mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, and unexplained misfortunes were quietly spread, ensuring that neighbors and other families would remain wary, isolated, and susceptible to further manipulation. People began to speak in hushed tones of the sisters who curse, though no one could provide proof. This reputation itself became a tool of terror, amplifying the sisters' influence far beyond their immediate environment. When it came to the fourth family, the sisters' approach was even more refined. They had learned from previous experiences the importance of precision and timing. This family was initially skeptical, observing the sisters but refusing to believe in any supernatural or calculated influence. The sisters, however, used this skepticism against them. They carefully orchestrated situations that appeared normal but contained subtle traps. Minor disputes were escalated into larger crises. Trusted advisors were manipulated or misled, and small accidents were timed to create maximum psychological stress. The cumulative effect was devastating. Over time, the family's health, morale, and social standing deteriorated under pressure that seemed untraceable and inexorable. The sisters' methods were not only about creating chaos, but also about maintaining control over perception. Each act of sabotage or manipulation was disguised as coincidence, accident, or incompetence on the part of others. They avoided direct confrontation, ensuring that suspicion never fell on them. The community, watching from the periphery, saw only a pattern of misfortune and tragedy that no one could explain. In this way, the sisters wielded fear like a weapon, demonstrating a mastery over human psychology that few could comprehend. By the time the fourth family's ruin was complete, the sisters had achieved something remarkable. They had managed to decimate 4 families without any overt use of force, without ever drawing direct suspicion, and without leaving a trace of their involvement. Their legacy was now firmly cemented in the folklore of Louisiana, a legend of intelligence, cruelty, and strategic genius wrapped in the guise of 2 young women who had been born into oppression, but refused to remain powerless. The destruction of these families sent ripples through the region. The story of the sisters became a cautionary tale, whispered in fear by both enslaved individuals and white landowners. Their actions demonstrated that power could manifest in unexpected ways, and that intelligence and cunning, even in the most oppressed, could upend lives and communities. By the end of their campaign, the sisters had become more than individuals. They were symbols of fear, revenge, and the unpredictable force of human ingenuity under extreme circumstances. In the aftermath, the remaining population on the plantations and surrounding communities approached the sisters with a mixture of awe, respect, and terror. Their reputation was such that even indirect contact could provoke anxiety and fear. The sisters had transformed themselves from observant children into orchestrators of calculated destruction, leaving an indelible mark on history. Their actions, meticulously planned and executed, ensured that the memory of their cunning would outlast the lives of those they had affected, and the generations that followed, solidifying their place in the dark legacy of Louisiana's past. The aftermath of the sisters' reign of calculated terror left the Louisiana plantation and the surrounding communities in a state of lingering fear and disbelief. The destruction of 4 families had fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape of the area, and yet, no one could ever definitively explain how it had occurred. The sisters themselves vanished from direct scrutiny, blending back into the population of enslaved workers as if nothing had happened. but their influence lingered like a shadow over every household. The community was left to grapple with the consequences of a power that was subtle, intelligent, and terrifyingly effective, leaving residents unsure of what was real and what was merely a manifestation of fear. In the immediate aftermath, neighbors and relatives of the ruined families struggled to make sense of the tragedies. Families that had once been wealthy and respected found themselves humiliated, financially crippled, and socially isolated. Friends and allies abandoned them, afraid that association with the cursed households might bring misfortune upon themselves. No one dared accuse the sisters directly. The incidents were so intricately designed that suspicion was nearly impossible to pin down. Instead, stories of misfortune, bad luck, and inexplicable accidents spread through whispers and rumors, cementing the sisters' reputation as figures of terror and supernatural cunning. Among the enslaved population, the sisters' actions became the subject of hushed discussions and cautious admiration. Many recognized the intelligence and strategic genius that had allowed two young women to outmaneuver powerful families and manipulate situations to such devastating effect. In a world where the oppressed were often powerless, the sisters had seized control in a manner that was nearly invisible yet profoundly impactful. Their actions demonstrated that influence could be wielded without weapons, threats, or direct confrontation, and this understanding left a lasting impression on the community. Even decades later, older generations would recount the tale of the sisters as a story of both caution and respect, a reminder that cunning could rival brute force. The families themselves never fully recovered. Some attempted to rebuild their fortunes and social standing, but the psychological toll of the sisters' manipulations had left deep scars. Paranoia, distrust, and anxiety permeated their households. Servants and neighbors were viewed with suspicion, and every misfortune, no matter how small, was examined for signs of hidden sabotage. Mental health, strained by continuous fear and uncertainty, deteriorated in several cases, and by the turn of the decade, the ruined families had largely disappeared from local prominence. Their absence served as a silent testament to the destructive skill of the sisters. Over time, the legend of the sisters grew, becoming more than a tale of historical events. It evolved into folklore. Stories circulated of their cleverness, ruthlessness, and uncanny ability to manipulate people and circumstances to their advantage. People began to attribute misfortunes to the lingering presence of the sisters' spirits, claiming that even long after their deaths, their influence could reach across households and generations. While skeptics dismissed such stories as exaggerations, the pattern of unexplained tragedies and the fear surrounding the sisters' name ensured that the legend persisted. The sisters themselves, if they survived beyond the immediate aftermath, remained enigmatic. No records indicate what became of them in later years, and the lack of documentation added to the aura of mystery surrounding their lives. Some accounts suggest that they were eventually sold or moved to distant plantations, where they quietly continued to exercise influence in smaller, less dramatic ways. Others claim that they disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the stories of the destruction they had orchestrated. Regardless of their fate, the community's collective memory preserved them as figures both feared and admired, a testament to their ingenuity and the impact of their actions. The broader impact of the sisters' deeds extended beyond the immediate social and economic consequences. Their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating intelligence and resilience in those who were oppressed. Plantation owners and overseers, hearing the stories passed down through generations, reportedly became more cautious, more suspicious, and more aware of the consequences of dismissing or underestimating the enslaved individuals under their control. The sisters' legacy, therefore, was not only personal and local, but also cultural, shaping the way communities approach control, obedience, and fear. Even in the modern era, the tale of the sisters has endured as a dark chapter in Louisiana's history. Folklorists, historians, and storytellers reference the sisters when discussing the complexities of power, resistance, and cunning in antebellum society. The sisters serve as a reminder that survival under oppression often required extraordinary intelligence, and in their case, that intelligence was paired with a ruthlessness that defied the norms of their time. The haunting stories of their actions continue to captivate imaginations, reflecting both the cruelty they could inflict and the ingenuity required to orchestrate such destruction. Ultimately, the legacy of the savage sisters is one of fear, awe, and enduring mystery. They were never ordinary women. They were survivors, strategists, and manipulators of human behavior on a scale rarely seen. Their actions reshaped the lives of 4 families and sent ripples of terror through their community that lasted for generations. While time may have eroded the physical traces of their existence, the psychological, social, and cultural impact of their deeds has endured, ensuring that the sisters remain immortalized in the dark, unsettling folklore of Louisiana. Their story serves as a chilling reminder of the power of intelligence, patience, and calculated vengeance, and of the enduring influence of those who refuse to be powerless, even in the harshest of circumstances.